Chapter 13. Dreamless this time, I drifted in a void that was my own being. Surrounding me, as much as I could call it me, was nothing. Not darkness per se, or any other shade of color. It was an absence of existence. I myself was without a body, just a thinking entity. This was new, right? Did that mean I was doing something right suddenly? A snap of realization hit me, and everything made so much more sense to me now. I was stuck inside of myself because the barrier I put around myself to stop views was still active, wasn't it? My consciousness couldn't slip back through the link that was still inside of me to that other world. To my other self, who I now realized wasn't as dead as I had originally assumed. What I saw in my dreams weren't dreams at all then, but me, waking as my other self. How was it possible? I knew enough about magic to realize that I should have died almost a week ago. That was the nature of Denig Veneficus, after all. It used my life force in order to heavily magnify my casting capability, all of it. That meant that either something was keeping me alive on the other side, or... well, it had never been proven or disproved, really. It was just a theory, set aside until alternate dimensions were stumbled upon. If the Einstein-Rosen bridge could be crossed, they debated that the time flows between dimensions might not entirely match up. I usually stopped paying attention when parallel universes and doubles started getting mentioned, though. Prior to suddenly finding myself as a pony, it didn't exactly have a lot to do with my life. Essentially, from what little I understood, the theory was that time might move slower or faster between dimensions. Normally a moot point, as most dimensionally traveling objects get squished into a fine singularity after entering the more traditional wormhole. Something tells me my case is slightly different based off the fact that I was somewhat more alive than I would be otherwise. What did that mean, though? Ultimately, it came down to only two things. Something might be forcing me to stay alive, which was really bad news if they had me. Or time was moving so slowly there that I just hadn't died yet. Better for Equestria. Worse for me. Now that I had these ponies, I realized I didn't want to give them up. But I was either on a time limit until I died, or holding open a link to hell itself on their doorstep. What was I supposed to do? A stirring. My body recovered from its exertion enough to regain consciousness, it seemed. Slowly, my eyes cracked open. Lavender mare staring at me? Check. Feeling like an icicle was stuck through my chest? Check. Symbols covering my skin, holding back a hungry eldritch abomination of quantum physics? Check. Still in Equestria, I see.
Oh, you're awake! Thanks, Celestia,
Twilight muttered, exhaling weakly. Honestly unsure of what to say to her, and suddenly feeling a little uncomfortable, I simply nodded quietly. Her eyes lowered a little as she saw my reaction, and she looked away.
Chin up, ponies. He's all right, so don't let the silly thing from yesterday stop what's important.
I heard Pinky chime in from somewhere behind me, in a surprisingly whimsical voice. Twilight sighed, but nodded. Her head slowly lowered and rested on the edge of the couch I resided on.
She's right. I'm sorry for my horrible behavior. I just didn't know how to react, and I freaked out, and then all of this happened. If you'd been at the library, I might have been able to help you, and after what happened yesterday, I should have realized I needed to keep a watch on you. This is all my
She exploded into apologies, burying her eyes in the edge of the couch. "Hey, Twilight," I interrupted, if only to get her attention. She stopped and looked back up at me, tears now going down her cheeks. I shook my head and gave her a smile. Once I had her attention, I continued with, "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable, so I'm sorry too."
I've been thinking about it a lot, all of last night, and I think we need to talk about it later, but right now there are more important things for us to worry about,"
she muttered, nodding again and looking away from me. This I wasn't expecting. She was acting almost ashamed of herself. I sighed, but was interrupted before I could say anything else. "Agreed. For example, properly thanking you for the hocus pocus you did to get that stuff out of me. That looked pretty painful for mine," Applejack suddenly added, popping upside down into my field of vision from above. There was a light bruise on her cheek and another on her neck from what I could see. Based off Fluttershy's recovery time, that meant I must not have been unconscious for very long. I chuckled and reminded, "I was the one that put you in danger in the first place. If you had gotten hurt..." Trailing off, I sighed. Yeah, I was selfish sometimes. Ultimately, I didn't want to die. I wanted to stay here in this amazing heaven I had found. But it looked like my time might have been running out. And if it came down to dying or potentially killing everyone here, was there really a choice?
That's not your fault, Mender. I finished compiling the results of my readings from yesterday. Your arrival was purely by accident, and those rocks caused the link still in you to resonate, becoming active again,"
Twilight explained. I nodded weakly. I'm connected to my world still, and now I'm acting like those rocks and trying to pull anything with a life signature through that link, I confirmed, not really feeling the energy she had found somehow. Still, she had come to the same conclusion I had. Her eyes lit up and she smiled.
"Yes, that's what the readings say. It explains all of the tiny discrepancies I noticed around the crater. My machine was picking you up too. It was coincidental that this dimension, passed close to yours at that exact moment, from what I've gathered. The only two questions that remain are, how did the connection form, and why is it still stable?"
She speculated, sitting down on her haunches again and looking perplexed. I'll give you insider information. The original me is still alive. Somehow, I revealed. Might as well give them as much information as I could. None of this could lead to anything good, as what was coming was pretty much inevitable. Twilight's eyes widened, and I heard both Applejack and Pinkie Pie gasp.
"Does that mean you're two ponies at once?"
Pinkie asked, sounding amazingly fascinated. We were all interrupted by a light snoring sound, followed by,
"That's hogwash."
Blinking, I and every pony else in the room momentarily turned towards the older mare with the light lime coat. Wait, I thought I'd seen her last night. Oblivious, her snores continued regardless of the new influx of attention. Applejack coughed lightly, sounding a little embarrassed. I'm mighty sorry, folks. Granny's not used to having to get up this early. Don't mind her," she muttered, cheeks flushing a little. Twilight blinked, then shook her head and shrugged before turning back to Pinkie.
"You're not that far off, Pinkie. So those dreams and visions were dimensional bleeding, not memories. That explains why Mender displayed elevated PTSD symptoms. But what made the link? And how are you still alive? It would require an incredible amount of energy to open even a temporary gateway,"
Twilight remarked, looking back at me and seeming flustered. She flipped open the notebook from yesterday and started going over her notes. I hadn't considered that. Post-traumatic stress disorder by itself would have been just fine, but I guess I get the dimensional bleed version. I'm lucky like that. Still, it was kind of refreshing to slip back into magical discussion so naturally. It seemed I was more comfortable when I could really contribute to a topic.
Now, wait just an apple-bucking minute. You're saying that he's acting like a link to that place that he's from?
Applejack asked. Twilight seemed perplexed by the question and simply nodded.
And now, every pony that pokes him gets pulled away to that there world?
She continued. I nodded this time, wondering where she was going with this.
Then, what happens when that one on the other side kicks the bucket, so to speak?
She asked, uncertain this time. That's where she was going. Twilight frowned, and her eyes drifted down towards her notes, as if trying to draw assurance from them.
I don't know. There are theories, but...
She spoke uneasily before trailing off.
Mender's gonna stick around though, right?
Came the uneasy voice of Applebloom. I glanced over my own body and spotted her sitting next to Pinky, both on the other cushion of the couch. Pinky looked surprisingly thoughtful, but Applebloom was watching me with a sad expression. She was worried? I hadn't thought I'd made that good of an impression, unless Sweetie Belle had been talking me up to her. Out of the three I had met so far, she seemed to like me the most. Twilight looked torn and flipped through her notes again. I saw that a few stray strands of her hair were splitting off from the others at odd angles. She looked stressed now that I was looking closer. Was it because she stayed up late analyzing the readings, or because of her freak-out yesterday? The silence held for several moments, and I sighed. She didn't want to say it, and I sort of understood why. I'd say it for her then, as it had to be said. Anything could happen. I might be fine and the link just shatters. Or I might be reliant on it, and I could fall apart without it. Another option is I might keep functioning but slip into a coma, my mind leaving with the link. We don't know. I spoke up, feeling gloomy. Applejack let out a frustrated snort and came around the side of the couch, stomping her hoof and glaring at me. She looked a mess, honestly, with bruises covering her entire front and both forelegs. They were ignored, however, and she gave a determined nod.
Huh. Well, I say pony feathers to that. That just means we gotta hurry up and do something about it,
she declared. I was slightly taken aback, and it must have showed as she got a confident smirk on her expression after a few seconds.
What are you proposing?
Twilight asked, looking as surprised as I felt.
Easy peasy. We just send some pony through with a link to Twi, then have her do that teleport thing she's so good at, pulling both the pony and Mender's twin back. Patch 'em up, good as new, and we're all fine and dandy,
she elaborated, whacking the floor with her hoof to punctuate each step. Twilight stared at her as if she were crazy. But I got a light smile. It was very simplistic, and there were a few parts that would need to be expanded on, but honestly, it was a better idea than I had. Although I had no idea how I could be two people at the same time. It's feasible, though a bit more complicated in execution, I agreed, looking at Twilight. She seemed to be the undeclared leader of the group, and plus I trusted her extensively when it came to magic. My experience with her was limited, but so far, aside from yesterday, she'd proven to be reliable. She watched me for a few seconds before nodding.
Well, maybe. It might work, but we'll need to figure out how to make a safe portal first,
she finally admitted, looking a little flustered. I raised an eyebrow to her, a little confused by her tension. Was she still upset about yesterday? Well, thinking about it, it seemed unreasonable to expect her not to be. Twilight dropped her notes to the floor, along with the quill, and sighed weakly, finally looking away from me.
I scoured the library last night on anything to do with dimensions and came up with pretty much nothing. Theories and speculation don't help us, and the potential risks are massive,
she warned, hanging her head and letting her bangs cover her eyes.
What choice do we have, silly? We need to do something to get him to feel better again, right? And you seem pretty concerned about him,
Pinky added, back to her usual sing-song mannerisms. Well, she technically spoke true, as I doubted I'd get better on my own. Twilight surprised me by simply blushing and staying quiet. Pinky got a knowing grin on her face, but relaxed into the sofa again. I was about to question Twilight when a quiet,
"Oh dear,"
sounded from the doorway. Glancing over, I saw the busted front door open again and Fluttershy come in, followed rapidly by Rainbow Dash and Rarity. Fluttershy looked momentarily taken aback and rapidly moved to where I lay. Twilight watched her curiously as she brushed a hoof timidly over my skin, causing a ripple to go along the symbols. "It's warded," I assured her, finding the energy to smile at least. Something about her presence was comforting regardless. There was something, an echo in my mind when she spoke. What was that?
"How are you feeling, Mender?"
Rainbow Dash asked, sitting on the other side of Twilight. Her question snapped me out of my sudden trance, and I glanced back to her. Applejack snickered, though, and bumped her sideways with her flank, spilling her off her hooves. "Probably a tad sore from when you dropped him on his head, right?" she reminded, winking down at the now blushing Cyan Pegasus. Pity I knew it probably wasn't Guild tinting her cheeks, but Applejack's flank instead.
"Hey, if he lost the barrier when he passed out, I would have been toast if I was still carrying him,"
she protested, waving a hoof dismissively towards Applejack. I mean, that was fair. I could take a meter drop or so, but I wasn't so sure she could survive long being eaten by an eldritch abomination. Rainbow Dash. I stared at her for a few seconds before I got a twinge in my head and winced. Twilight and Fluttershy both noticed and leaned closer to me, the former asking,
Are you alright? Oh dear. Perhaps we should get him someplace warmer and a bit to eat,
Rarity suggested, resting on her haunches in front of Pinky's spot on the couch and frowning at me. I closed my eyes for a few seconds as another wave of dizziness crept over me. Her image was in the dream. Was it a dream? I doubted it. Those colors, that meant she was connected to that day. I opened my eyes and looked at her and found her looking back. Then I noticed everyone was looking at me now, having heard Fluttershy and Rarity. Dash looked surprised to be locked into my focus, however, and tilted her head. I watched her for a few more seconds before quietly asking, Rainbow Dash, on the day of the really bad storm, were you practicing above the field? Her eyes widened in surprise, and every pony turned to look at her, Twilight grabbing her notes again with record speed.
Wait, how the heck did you know that?
She asked, looking honestly surprised and vaguely angry. Swallowing, I realized I was right. Twilight was right. Did you do a sonic rainboom that day? I asked weakly, starting to get a bit apprehensive. Things were starting to slide together again, and it wasn't looking good. Rainbow's eyes narrowed as she glared at me, but Twilight shuffled forwards a little.
Please, Rainbow, it might be important. I don't see why it's any pony's business what my training regimens are,
she protested, crossing her forelegs in front of her. Why didn't she want to answer? Please? Trust me, I asked tiredly, shifting so I could see her better. To my surprise, her expression softened when I said that, and she let out a sigh.
Fine, okay, yes, I trust you. I was practicing my skywriting. I got it in my head to try to make the message more awesome with a sonic rainbow. I haven't gotten them down to an exact science yet, and I knew I'd be busy with the storm later, so I was practicing earlier in the day.
She finally answered. Ah, that explains why she didn't want to say anything, with the pony of her affections being right there.
Did you pull it off then, Rainbow?
Applebloom asked with a bit of excitement in her voice, surprising me. She hopped up, using my left flank as a stool for her two front legs, grinning at Rainbow over me. Rainbow smiled at her, her irritation apparently disarmed by the little filly's cuteness.
Yeah, once. I was ecstatic until I realized it didn't really mix well with the rainbow trail and turned my message into bits of burning rainbow falling to the field,
she elaborated, blushing again. Somehow I managed not to laugh. Yeah, that probably wouldn't convey that particular message very well. Nothing says I love you like burning chunks of rainbow falling from the sky like meteors. All the same, it all slid together in an instant. Abadak snickered and nodded to Rainbow, helping her up as Twilight turned and looked back at me questioningly. Yep, it told me what I needed. The rocks and I arrived at the same moment if Twilight's theory of dimension shifts was accurate. We were phased out of my reality at the exact second my spell activated. It dug into me to use my life force to fuel it at the same moment the atmosphere exploded from the energy of the planet buster. It had been known to happen before. Barriers were conductive to other forms of energy, and I must have gathered it like a lightning rod. Then, as Twilight said, the dimensions shifted close to each other, and Rainbow Dash performed her sonic rainboom in the same area, generating a huge amount of energy on this side, and forming the link with the resonations. Due to the time differences, she actually would have had a feasible window of opportunity to do so. Of course, her rainboom wasn't anywhere near on the same level as a planet buster, so there had to be some localization involved. The field she was in was probably close, locally, to my area through the dimensional phasing. The probabilities surrounding the event were phenomenally mind-boggling. Regardless, the rainboom synergized with my barrier, which was tied to me, and I bled through, splitting my life force and having a new body form due to the regenerative effect it had on me before the battle. Standard issue. Probably, anyway. But why a pony? My deductions sort of dawdled off at that point. Hardly mattered, though, as I had most of the pieces to the mystery, and just about all of the important ones. I must have zoned out for a few moments.
Mender, are you okay?
Twilight asked, looking concerned. Yeah, I think I was one of those burning bits of rainbow, I admitted, swallowing. Both Twilight and Rainbow's eyes expanded to the size of saucers. Stretching, I tried to keep warm in the high-altitude air by rubbing my forelegs together. It didn't help much, and my coat ended up puffing anyway. It was still a beautiful view, though. The hot air balloon swayed gently in the wind, and I was positioned so I could look over the side. We were very high up, and the view was amazing. Gentle moisture from the clouds around us clung to the side of the basket and silently turned to frost. It was peaceful, if not melancholy. I drew comfort in it. The sea of clouds washed away the view of the ground far below, and it felt like my worries went with it. Twilight's sensor device continued to make a light ticking noise behind me, and I heard the light scribbling on her floating notepad next to her as she glued her eyes to the device.
This is crazy,
she muttered again, looking up from the dancing lines across the paper readout. Rainbow Dash snickered from the other side of me, and I heard the shifting of leather.
You said that already, Twi. You know we don't have time to be so sane about this.
Rainbow remarked, sounding deceptively excited. I could tell, even with the potential danger, she was getting giddy. She seemed the type who liked an adrenaline rush.
We need to think this out more. If anything goes wrong, anything at all, it could mean getting lost in a totally different place. Possibly forever.
Twilight warned, exasperated. Rainbow rolled her eyes and sighed.
And if we don't hurry, what's the risk of some big, horrible race of unstoppable monsters invading and destroying, like, everything?
She returned, adjusting her wings again. Fluttershy stood behind her, softly manipulating the series of leather straps that Rainbow Dash wore in a makeshift harness. Embarrassingly enough, with my current level of strength, and barely having the ability to walk by myself, I wouldn't be able to hold on to her at normal speeds, let alone the velocity required to accomplish opening a gate. Thus, the harness. I had recovered some of my strength after waking up, but I was nowhere near the level I was at before, which was to say I was even weaker than my previous pathetic self. Tala looked beyond frustrated, but she nodded sharply, accepting the point. And I had to agree. There was no way of knowing how risky it was leaving an open connection to those monsters, because I knew full well what they were capable of. Without the ability to experiment, this is the most accurate method possible. Recreate the angle, location, speed, even the mare involved. It's the best shot we have, I added, shifting my attention to the ground instead.
I know. I just really don't like having nothing solid to go off of. Plus, this plan is risking two of my best friends,
she muttered, checking her readings for probably the 100th time. Best friend? She hadn't even known me a week yet. I took a rain check on my thoughts, deciding they might be a little too cynical, and rephrased it a little before voicing it. You've only known me a little less than a week, though, I pointed out, deciding that was phrased a little less venomously. Twilight stopped taking scribbled notes and looked back over at me, a slightly saddened expression on her face.
You think too little of yourself, Mender. I think I speak for every pony here when I say you're a good pony. And a good friend,
she reiterated. I'd heard her say it before, but it was still a little difficult to really listen to it. To believe it. Was I a good pony? I didn't want to die. But if that's what it took to destroy the link, what was I supposed to do? Could I honestly live with myself if I potentially doomed this entire dimension to a repeat of what happened in mine? No. As much as I didn't want to admit it, Equestria was bigger than I could ever hope to be.
We're doing this to save you, right? That has to prove that we're your friends.
Fluttershy spoke quietly, agreeing in her typical hushed whisper. I nodded gently, still plagued with guilt over my own feelings and wondering how much easier it would be to simply jump over the edge of the balloon. No more choices, no more greed or selfish impulses. Equestria's potential problems would be erased along with my life. And ponies could move on without me, no longer in any danger from them. The Grosh. Shuddering at the name, I found myself considering me more as an intruder, a disruption than just a traveler. If I was truly a mistake, it meant I didn't belong here to complicate things, no matter how kind and friendly I tried to be. No matter how friendly they were to me. Twilight swallowed uncomfortably in the silence, eyes filled with unease and apprehension. She looked stressed, like she had a horrifying secret bottled up for centuries and desperately wanted to pull it out of her. Well, okay, I was probably seeing it as more dire than it actually was, but she still looked strung out.
Just be careful, okay? Both of you. You two need to be all right,
she said, her expression softening as she looked down again.
Relax, Twy. I'm a pro at speed. There's not really any danger.
Rainbow half assured, half bragged. Twilight let out a small giggle and seemed to agree. She trusted her, obviously. And frankly, Rainbow's boisterous nature served to vent the stress of the situation amazingly well. She kept things light, kind of like Pinkie Pie. She also distracted everyone from noticing that I didn't make any such promises. If it came down to either myself or Equestria, no matter how vague the potential threat may be, I silently vowed to make the correct one. I turned and looked back over the side, lowering my eyes and steadying my resolve. I needed to focus. We were at the right altitude. A direct angle to the crater point at roughly 85 degrees, and a good half-dozen kilometers off the ground, moderate cloud cover around us. A light parting of the clouds occurred, and I watched the 4 large flags being erected on the ground level by Applejack and Rarity. They were lined up with the crater and angled to face us as we stayed anchored above the calculated point where Rainbow fired off the sonic rainboom that day. It was a simple plan. Fire another one off at the exact same spot, with me in the middle of it, and try to open another stable portal. Easier said than done, I know. Failure at that step meant pretty much nothing, though. I saw the pink pony circling below us still, on that strange gyrocopter machine she had. She had finished setting up the large net directly in our path of descent. I checked the velocity and mass calculations myself, and both Twilight and I agreed that it should stop a potentially lethal fall should the portal fail to open. Rainbow thought it was unnecessary, but Twilight insisted on it. I wasn't worried about Rainbow Dash's abilities so much, but on the effects of trying to pull this off with me on her back. A solid 5 minutes passed in silence before Twilight put her now rather sizable notes down.
Okay, from these calculations, you're right. I triple-checked the results dozens of times, so there's not much else for it. In all theory, repeating the same event as close as possible should yield the same result.
Twilight agreed finally, giving me a weak smile. Well, on the bright side, things are significantly less awkward now that she seemed frustrated about something other than me and her flank. Still not sure if that's a good thing. Have to look into it more later. Well, provided I was still alive. I smiled back at her. You did the calculations right. With the time-lapse variation, our window should still be wide open for a good 48 hours. We can try this as many times as we need to today and still have clearance to try something else if it doesn't work. And empirically, this is our most accurate shot, I reminded. Her expression softened and she nodded, a genuine smile on her face. Rainbow snickered behind me and I braced for verbal impact.
I never thought I'd see another pony who can say so much, but nothing at all,
she remarked.
Hey, just because you don't understand it doesn't mean he's not saying anything,
Twilight defended, much to my surprise. She actually defended me? Well, herself too, but still.
Relax, Twi. I'm just happy hearing all the magic dork babbling cheers you up. Or is that a hint of hot and bothered I see in your eyes?
She questioned, teasing playfully with a wink. Twilight switched to shocked and blushing in a heartbeat. Fluttershy, however, jerked stiffly while adjusting the metal backstrap as if burned, and Rainbow instantly let out a pained choking noise as she flailed her forearms, eyes bugging out. I tried my hardest not to laugh. I mean, for one thing, it was rude, but it would also draw attention to my own lightly flushed cheeks. Fluttershy was scarlet and gawking bluntly at Twilight, body rigid. Twilight stared back awkwardly, blushing herself before coughing. It was at about this point that Fluttershy seemed to notice what she was doing to Rainbow. She made a little squeaking noise and slid the strap back into place, somewhat blushing more than before. Rainbow fell back to all fours, holding her neck with one hoof while glaring at Fluttershy.
Okay, you deserved that,
Twilight muttered, shaking her head and wearing a victorious smirk. Her cheeks were still a bright crimson, but I said nothing lest she kick me out of the balloon this time. Rainbow sighed and sat up again.
I was just kidding. Yeesh.
She defended, rasping. Rainbow, I muttered, frowning at her. Her eyes lowered away from me and she nodded.
Yeah, I know. I got you in trouble once already because of my big mouth. Honest, I was just teasing.
She swore. Twilight raised an eyebrow at her, however.
Wait, you never got him in trouble. What are you talking about?
She asked. Huh? How is being kicked out of the library not being in trouble? Rainbow seemed to silently agree as she tilted her head towards her. Fluttershy seemed to be in the same boat, giving her a questioning glance as well.
Twilight, you kicked him out of the library. I'd say that's about as in trouble as it gets with you, isn't it?
Rainbow pointed out, flexing her wings out again. She had such a way with words.
What? No, I didn't kick him out. I just didn't want him in the loft at night. Is a little privacy so wrong?
She reasoned, defensively crossing her forelegs. I rotated around to face them again as the whirling noise ascended to my right. This wasn't going to be pretty.
Ooh, but Fluttershy said you hurled his bed down the stairs and almost flattened him with it.
Pinky exclaimed merrily, leveling her copter off with the height of the balloon.
What?
Twilight yelped, turning and glaring at the new verbal assaulter. Fluttershy blushed and coughed.
Well, you kinda did. No offense, please don't be mad.
She muttered weakly. Hey, come on now, it had a couple meters of clearance from me. I tried to defend. Rainbow burst into laughter. Pinky looked deeply amused. Twilight blushed furiously again and looked down at the floor of the balloon.
You could have stayed in the library, Mender, just not in the loft.
She addressed directly to me. Fluttershy looked sad and beat me to responding, unfortunately asking,
You wanted him to stay in the main floor where all the ponies visit? In the night drift?
Oddly, there was a slight hint of disapproval in her voice.
Nah, she was gonna throw him in the basement,
Rainbow Dash muttered sarcastically, rolling her eyes.
Ooh, spooky,
Pinky added, sounding oddly excited by the prospect. Fluttershy, however, seemed to miss the sarcasm entirely and let out a horrified gasp.
That's horrible! How could you, Twilight? He's sick!
Fluttershy protested, a few decibels louder than usual. Gullible, but very loyal. I caught myself blushing again.
I was kidding, Fluttershy,
Rainbow groaned, slapping a hoof to her face.
Fine! Okay, I'm sorry. I overreacted. I'm just not comfortable with things I can't study or have experience with.
Twilight apologized, flopping onto her forelegs. I nodded gently. I know how you feel. Things can be scary when you don't know anything about them. I agreed. Twilight gave me a soft smile, looking grateful. Pinky giggled and nodded behind her as well.
Then you just need to get to know him more, right? He's not gonna hurt any pony,
she reasoned, smiling while hovering closer on her machine. Sighing, I slid down the side of the basket and sat down tiredly on the floor. I would never hurt any of these amazing ponies. Fluttershy sat down half a meter away and looked at me with concern. Twilight, who was already sitting, frowned as well and scooted closer.
Are you all right?
She asked hesitantly. I'm just tired. I'd never hurt either of you, and I understand why things are the way they are, I assured quietly, looking down instead. Rainbow raised an eyebrow, but Fluttershy tilted her head and asked,
What do you mean?
I shook my head weakly, not really wanting to talk about it. Rainbow, however, surprised me by letting out a gasp and gave me a feisty glare.
Wait a minute! You never told me what was wrong!
She suddenly announced out of nowhere. Huh? Pinky giggled somewhere above me.
He likes Fluttershy, duh. Her saying that would kinda hurt.
She explained for me. My secret being told didn't really even register in my mind, and I continued blankly staring at the spot on the balloon gondola's wall somewhere between Dash and Twi's machine.
What?
Rainbow Dash gasped, looking stunned.
Pinky? How did you find out?
Twilight half asked, half reprimanded. Fluttershy looked down sadly, but was also wearing a light blush. I shifted my attention to her. Pinky giggled again, sounding like she moved closer to the gondola wall.
Well, it was super duper obvious. But my pinky sense was a twitchin' when he looked at Flutters. And Twi, too. Some ponies indecisive.
She exclaimed mirthfully, and I felt a hoof patting me on the head. My eyes drooped, and I nodded weakly, looking at my hind legs. It was probably a strange posture for a pony, but I didn't really care. If I'm somehow still alive by the end of this week, I'm going to have to figure something out to fix that, I muttered, mostly to myself. Fluttershy frowned and shifted closer to me, putting a hoof on my left back knee. Were all 4 of my legs having knees now, or were the front ones elbows? Questions for later. Twilight maintained a blank expression, but I saw her swallow uneasily. She knew that me not surviving was a possibility.
Don't be a frowny face. Dash here will make sure you're totally all right. She's an amazing flyer,
Pinky assured. Dash smiled and nodded confidently, walking towards me.
Yeah, don't worry about it, Mender. I'm sticking with you through the whole thing,
she assured, a twinkle dancing in her eyes. She still looked excited, but proud, confidence almost dripping off of her. It was hard to resist her energy this time, and I smiled as well, nodding back up at her.
So let's just get this over with, hit him hard and fast, and then come home laughing by the end of the day,
she offered, extending her hoof towards me and still smirking. Nodding, I hooked hooves with her and let her pull me into a sitting position. She nodded and turned away from me, lowering herself to the floor of the gondola. I closed my eyes, gathered my confidence up, and stepped slowly onto her back and into the harness.